Deputy Daly is 7.5 minutes.
I think it is a case, Count Corla, of here we go again. Dáil business suspended while the Minister for Justice comes in to explain himself. And I really wonder how long it's going to take for the penny to drop, or for the backbenchers in Fine Gael or the Labour Party to join the dots and realise that we have a serious problem in this country. And the problem is twofold, in my opinion. It is firstly that we are not dealing with isolated examples. We are dealing with an institutional problem, and a problem that patently will not be dealt with while you remain as the Minister for Justice. You've come in here, you've twittered away to your friends sitting beside you, you went on the attack earlier on and you attempted to deflect. We heard there's no basis to the allegations of Garda McCabe, much the same that there was no basis to the surveillance of GSOC, something you called so-called vulnerabilities. You told us that you don't have any animosity towards Garda McCabe, but you spent most of your contribution trying to undermine him. In much the same way, to be honest, as you told us that you were a great supporter of GSOC. You love them, they're all behind them, but every action you've done has been to accuse them of not fulfilling their statutory duty and of undermining them at every turn. Now, you spent a lot of time in your points saying that it wasn't true that the original complaints of Garda McCabe were not investigated, that all of those complaints were investigated. And I'd like to say to you that you're absolutely correct. 100%. But they were investigated by procedures which have demonstrably found to be inadequate. The Gardaí investigating themselves, a toothless GSOC and a confidential recipient that was not fit for purpose. Now, these procedures were inadequate to deal with the penalty points. Clearly, they're inadequate to deal with all of the other allegations as well, and you think you can get away with it by deflecting. The reality is that you can't. Now, the Morris Tribunal talked about being staggered by a small but disproportionately influential core of people at the force. And we were told that measures were being brought in were going to deal with this. Now, it's quite clear for some time now that the measures which have been implemented haven't dealt with the problems. But we have to be honest. For those of us who've been raising these points for quite some time now, we're actually ridiculed up until very recently in those points. We were met with passionate speeches about how crime was being reduced, what great Gardaí were out there, and of course there are great Gardaí out there, but they too need a transparent Garda force. And in my opinion, there is a small but disproportionately influential core, the core identified by Smithick as those demonstrating loyalty to the force above honesty. And I think it's epitomised more than anything else in the antics of the Garda Commissioner, who called the whistleblowers disgusting, who called them so-called whistleblowers, who he wouldn't allow undermine his officers. And it's this mentality of the force being separate to the interests of the public that they're supposed to serve. Now, to break down that link requires a political will. To make the Gardaí requires a political will. But unfortunately, the nature of the relationship between yourself and the Commissioner, in my opinion, is making that impossible and is now actually a key part of the problem. And genuinely, I see it's very hard to see how we can move in with that fairly gigantic elephant in the room, and it really has to be addressed, because every response put forward by this government has been too little, too late. It took you 18 months to appoint GSOC to investigate the penalty points. Your response to GSOC surveillance was to have an inquiry into them, not the alleged source of their surveillance. And now you're setting up an inquiry into seeing, do we need an inquiry? Well, I have to be honest with you, the issues have gone way too far for that. Of course we need a proper commission of inquiry into everything that has gone on over the last while. But you know what? That's actually the easy bit. The more difficult bit and the more necessary bit is the bit alluded to by Deputy Wallace, the urgent legislative form that is needed on this, that we highlighted in the summer and that you basically laughed out of court, although you have adopted some of the points now. You don't need to bring these issues to the Justice Committee. GSOC have already told you what they needed and you've ignored them. They issued recommendations after the Kieran Boylan report which haven't been implemented yet, and so on. I think that not only that, but probably more important, the idea that you and Commissioner Callanan can remain at the helm is actually unsustainable at this stage. And, you know, I am saying this lightly, and I'm not saying it based on jumping to conclusions. I'm basing it on my knowledge of the facts. Now, you said that Sergeant Maurice McCabe's serious allegations into malpractice, very serious corruption in the Bailey-Burrow-Cavan area were investigated, and these things aren't black and white. And that's true. But what is black and white is that Sergeant Maurice McCabe was demonised, bullied, discredited and moved out of that station. What is black and white is he was told there's no case to answer over cases which clearly there are questions to answer. Now, I'm not saying in instances like the tragic murder of Sylvia Roach Kelly that any Garda wanted that to happen. Clearly that's not the case. Clearly it's good that her murderer is in prison. But the point that people are making is it's an awful pity that he wasn't in there before he murdered her, and he could have been if the Gardaí had done their job properly. And these actions or inactions have consequences. Instead of dealing with it, what she did was shoot the messenger. And luckily for Irish society that this messenger was made of sterner stuff, and Sergeant Maurice McCabe didn't back down despite the enormous personal consequence on him. And you see, the difference with the penalty points is that it was possible to prove what went on there. But even there, it took us a massive battle. 18 months, he went to every arm of the state to get answers, and only then did we get them. But what it did do is show his credibility, and it meant that the other allegations were now being listened to. That was hugely important. Now, I'm glad that Fianna Fáil has stood up and woken up to this issue. I'm glad that others who will be speaking on this issue haven't said a word about it since it started. I'm glad that people are learning about the seriousness of this issue, but you aren't. Most clearly, by your antics here today, you're not. We see the exact same approach as you dealt with the penalty points. There we heard it wasn't a systems problem. There were only 189 allegations, and sure, half of them were wrong in any way, you told us. Now we hear, oh, there's a load of allegations, but that's all they are. There's probably nothing to them. Wrong. And the reason why we can say they're wrong is because of so many other instances. The Taoiseach received a letter this week from Ian Bailey, who on foot of the Taoiseach asking for others who had evidence of malpractice. Now, as you know, Minister, 5 Supreme Court judges have stated that the behaviour of Gardaí in relation to Ian Bailey was wrongful, breathtaking misconduct. Okay? They offered a drug user €5,000 and drugs to incriminate Ian Bailey. And the Garda, who was named in the DPP's report as doing that, was sent to France to advise the French on the criminality of Ian Bailey. We know that the Kieran Boylan case, the handler at the centre of the Kieran Boylan case, has been promoted to the senior ranks of Garda Síochána. And we know that in the tragic case of Father Niall Malloy, that in 2012, 10 Gardaí were appointed again to investigate that on foot of new information from Gemma O'Doherty. And guess what they found? Nothing. No evidence, no prosecutions, and no one talking to Gemma O'Doherty either, I might add, something that internal investigations are obviously fond of. Don't interview the person who brings the information. And of course our own cases, whereby through the work that we did originally, people the length and breadth of this country began to contact us. And we went with them to your department in October of this year, where almost 30 citizens handed in tragic cases of Garda malpractice and a failure to achieve justice on behalf of citizens of the state. Now, of course, we don't know if all those allegations are true, but I do know that the people who went sincerely believed them to be so. And what happened? Them, most of them average age of about 60, I'd say, and 4 TDs in this House were locked out of the Department of Justice, and we had to negotiate on the telephone to even get the door open. Minister, there's a problem of culture here, and your relationship with the Commissioner is at the heart of it. Now, you spent some time dealing, again, with this allegation of yours, which can be disproven, that Garda Morris McCabe and indeed Garda John Wilson did not cooperate with the investigation. In your speech here today, you say that they failed an invitation from John O'Mahony to attend. Well, that's a bit peculiar, because John O'Mahony was at the PAC committee, and in response to a question from Deputy MacDonald, said clearly that he didn't ask or invite Garda Morris McCabe to participate in that. So you're just wrong. And what I would take issue with Deputy Martin is, I think one of the reasons why you're wrong is that you lean too much on the information given to you by the Garda Commissioner at every turn, because the only evidence, so-called evidence, that Garda Morris McCabe or Garda John Wilson did not cooperate with the inquiry is this so-called directive from the Garda Commissioner on the 14th of December. Now, I want to put on the record that this directive is a shut up and back off directive. No other explanation will tally. And I just want, you know, everybody's talking about this now, but the issue wasn't always so popular. And I want you to put you back in the minds of those people. An internal investigation was set up at the end of October. 5 chief superintendents, 6 superintendents, 7 office staff and all their other staff, meeting for 7 months. They're sitting up there for a month and they don't come near any of the whistleblowers in that. Suddenly, Deputy Mick Wallace, using a sleight of hand, puts onto the Dáil record by asking a question that wasn't on the agenda because our questions have been ruled out of order, put it on the Dáil record, and fair play, Minister Varadkar answered him in that regard. Prime Time ran with it, and now it was a story. What happens next? What happens next is those whistleblowers are sitting in their base, and 2 days later a confidential circular goes up on the notice board in order to protect the reputation of Garda Síochána. Everybody who accesses Pulse will be audited. It goes on to say that anybody who releases information will be investigated. The next day, press statement from the Commissioner saying no culture of writing off penalty points. A couple of days later they're called in, they're told not to access Pulse, they're not allowed to take a copy of the letter. It's read out to them. They're told to stop accessing those records. Garda John Wilson has his car searched by his colleagues. A couple of days later, there's another directive, and I'll end on this point, because it wasn't a directive to participate with the inquiry. It was a further direction to stop accessing Pulse. Now, if that isn't a modus operandi of trying to shut down this inquiry, then I don't know what is. The last point I'll make, Count Corla, is, Minister, you've been at pains to put a divide between the operational responsibility of Garda Síochána and the policy ones. And I can only detect from that your friend Commissioner Callanan will be joining your previous friend Oliver Connolly on the ranks of the unemployed, while you intend to soldier out this controversy. I am heartily sick of this situation. I am disgusted by your antics, your behaviour here today and your behaviour over the past period. And you know what? I don't want to be part of a society which stands over this type of cover-up, and I don't think Irish citizens do. You might think you've got away with it, but you haven't.